Good afternoon, evening, morning, whenever you're watching this. Maybe it's 2 a.m. and this is on your automatic recommended. My name is Professor Ferrero, and we are going to be getting into the lesson today. So, today's lesson, we are going to be covering the closeout of the American West. This is going to be U.S. history up until the present from 1877 to the present. So, previous lecture, we talked about the Gilded Age. We went over the rapid progress that happened during the Second Industrial Revolution, as well as all of the problems with it. The closeout of the West is going to be happening in tangent, in congruence with the Second Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age. It's going to be the end of Westward Expansion. All of the ideas and topics covered in U.S. history before 1877 are going to finally come to a close as the United States is going to finish settling the contiguous 48. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So, moving westward, we have to go a little bit back to U.S. history before 1877 to understand what is going on. So, the Homestead Act is going to be passed by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. The purpose of the Homestead Act was to encourage westward migration, to encourage Americans to settle out on U.S. territory. And a large part of that is Lincoln wanted a more solid claim for the Union with that territory. Now, the Homestead Act had a couple of requirements. It required you to be a US citizen, you had to be the head of the household, you had to stay on the land for 5 years and make it better. And you could also not have formerly been in open rebellion against the United States, which, thanks to the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, is going to allow African Americans to use the Homestead Act. That is going to come up later, and it is also going to bar ex Confederates from using the Homestead Act. A lot of African Americans are actually going to use this as a way out of the South. It's going to lead to a lot of diversity actually out in the American West. That's why a lot of states like California, if you look, there's a lot of ethnic diversity out there even today. So, all of this is going to culminate in the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. We talked about that from an industrial perspective in the previous lecture, in lecture 5.1, but the Transcontinental Railroad is also going to allow easier transport of people across the country. It's going to allow settling out west to be a lot more viable of an option. This isn't the days of the Oregon Trail where you just throw your family in back of a wagon, slap it on a cart on some ox, and go. No, this is going to be people actually being able to settle out here and make a livelihood, and really the closeout of the frontier. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862, also passed by Lincoln, is going to help further that. The creation of the American Railroad, of the Transcontinental Railroad, break down the words transcontinental, trans being mean to move from one to another, and continental is literally a railroad that cuts across the continent. It cuts from the East Coast to the West Coast. Majority of the railroad is going to be completed by two groups of immigrants. It's going to be Chinese immigrants, Irish immigrants. They're going to be preferred over American citizens. Primary reason being is because they are immigrants, they are willing to take far less pay. And the Chinese immigrants in particular are extremely talented in terms of getting this done, in terms of building the actual railroad. They're going to work through deserts. They're going to work through blizzards. There are stories of Chinese immigrants literally having to dig holes in the snow to keep warm, making makeshift igloos. In total, you're going to have about 15,000 Chinese workers help build these railroads. If you watch any of my, I guess at this point, future videos on US history before 1877, you know that a lot of Chinese immigrated to the United States to supplement the loss of farm workers after the end of slavery. They're going to very quickly transition to building out the Transcontinental Railroad. They see a lot of the economic opportunity here in the United States is really the second big wave. The first was the 1949 gold rush in California. That brought in a lot of Chinese immigrants. That's why if you look, the West Coast has a very, very high population of Asians compared to the rest of the country. Ultimately, they're going to be preferred over their white counterparts because, again, they can pay them less, oftentimes up to 50% less. These men are going to be blasting holes through mountains. They're going to be working through blizzards, and they're going to be facing a lot of racial discrimination from their supervisors as well. You see a rise in the spike of nativism. We talked about that a little bit last lecture as well. Nativism isn't just going to affect Southern and Eastern Europeans, it's also going to affect Chinese immigrants as well. Nativists, they want you to be three things. They want you to be white, they want you to be English speaking, and they want you to be Protestant. That is going to lead them into conflict with quite a few groups out in the West, such as Chinese, who, at least immigrating to the United States, are none of those things. They don't speak English, they tend to be Buddhist, and they're not white. Or Hispanics. Maybe you have white passing Hispanics, but they don't speak English potentially. And even if they do speak English, they're Catholic. And furthermore, the Mormons are some of the whitest whites who ever white. If you've ever met a Mormon, you know that they are ridiculously white. But the Mormons are not Protestant. So all of these groups are going to be coming into conflict with nativists out in the Western frontier. This increased Chinese immigration is going to lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act. All of these Chinese are going to come in, they're going to build up the railroads, but in 1882, they're going to bar further Chinese immigrants from entering the United States. The US was very, very split in terms of opinions on this. There were plenty of Americans who were in favor of Chinese immigrants moving to the United States and becoming Chinese Americans. However, there was a large majority in the country who believed that Chinese individuals were incapable of assimilating to American culture. They believed that Chinese culture was too different from Western civilization, from the American culture, and therefore couldn't assimilate. In large part, they were also afraid that they were taking a lot of jobs. As you'll learn here through US history, we don't really have new problems. We just have repetitions of old problems over and over and over again. While Asian American men were technically protected under the 14th and 15th Amendments, which basically says if you're born here on US soil and you're a US citizen, you're allowed to vote, often they're going to be barred from voting. In fact, ironically enough, California is going to be a lot more tolerant of African Americans than they are going to be of Asian Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Act is really only meant to, I believe, last for about 10 years, but it keeps getting extended and it's not going to be repealed until 1943. That is 2 years into the US's involvement in World War II. That is an extremely long time. That is 61 years of Chinese being denied access to the United States here. Here you can see a political cartoon. I always encourage you to go ahead and just take a moment to break down these cartoons, pause the video, write down your own interpretation of what you think you're seeing. I highly, highly encourage you to do that. But looking right here, we see the Golden Gates of Liberty. He is outside of the US. The US is behind the Golden Gates of Liberty, and if you notice, you have a Chinese immigrant here. He's bringing a lot of good things with him. Industry, order, peace, sobriety. The only one barred out. Looking at this placard over here, you see a lot of people who aren't great for the United States being allowed in. Communists, nihilists, socialists, Fenians, and hoodlums, all of them welcome, but no admittance to the Chinamen. So, as we can see, there's this cartoon is basically showing the hypocrisy and why it is wrong for the United States to not want Chinese immigrants in the United States. Here we see another political cartoon commenting on whether or not all of this is okay. I encourage you to pause the video and just take a moment to see whether or not you think this cartoon is in favor of the Chinese Exclusion Act or is critical of it. So, looking at this picture, you see multiple figures. You see a Chinese gentleman, you see a Native American gentleman, and then you see an African American gentleman in the background. Going ahead and looking at it, you can see a lot of the posters. They are replying to a lot of the racial issues going on in the United States. Go West. Look at who's getting forced out with Go West, Native Americans. And ironically enough, when the Chinese show up, go East. We got to run away from them. We got to get away from them. The Chinese problem prohibits immigration, foreigners not wanted, know nothingism of the past, down with the Irish, down with the Dutch. The Irish and the Dutch are going to face a lot of racial discrimination earlier on in the United States. They're really going to see more of it in the early to mid 1800s, not really the late 1800s. And at the bottom it says, every dog, no distinction of color, has its day. You may have heard the classic slogan, every dog has its day. The red gentleman to the yellow gentleman, pale face, afraid you crowd him out as he did me. Basically going to say that the whites in the country at the time, not all of them, but many of them, were afraid that there wasn't enough room in the country for Chinese Americans and for white America. Native American guys basically saying, I've been through the same thing. Ultimately, hopefully you guessed this. This is critical of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is showing the hypocrisy and why it's wrong. Not everything out in the West is bad, though. We mentioned the Homestead Act earlier. A lot of African Americans in the South are going to use this as an opportunity to escape racism and discrimination down in the South. The South, post Reconstruction, post the North pulling its troops out and implementing martial law, African Americans in the South are going to face a lot of discrimination. We have a lot of laws put on the books to make sure that African Americans aren't having their rights respected. You can see here, Ho for Kansas. Brethren, friends, and fellow citizens, I feel thankful to inform you that the Real Estate and Homestead Association will leave here the 15th of April, 1878. Ultimately, you're going to see a lot of African Americans use the Homestead Act to get land out west. The West, at least, tends to be more tolerant of African Americans. The West, they can get free land up there. They can get free territory. Their options are stay in the South and deal with a bunch of racist jerks, deal with racial discrimination, or move out west and get free land. Needless to say, many of them are going to take that opportunity up. Many of them are going to be settling in states such as Kansas. This was known as a larger movement of African Americans known as the Great Migration, which is going to take place from the late 1870s really up until the 1920s and arguably the 1930s. It's going to be about a 50-year period of African Americans leaving the South, leaving segregation, or leaving Jim Crow, and trying to find better opportunities around the country. And the Homestead Act is really, and the Exodusters, you can see it in the name. Exodus, which literally means to exit, and dusters, kicking up dust as they are heading out west. So African Americans are going to use the Homestead Act to further advance opportunities for them. So, what about Native Americans? Native American removal. Going ahead and looking at how Native Americans are being treated, they're also not being treated so hot out in the West. I would say they are arguably getting the worst treatment of everybody out West. The Dawes Act of 1887 is going to be passed, and it is going to break the Native American reservation systems up. Ultimately, Native Americans, they were promised land, they were promised territory in these reservations. And one of the most tragic things in American history is how the United States continued to deny them their sovereignty and to deny them access to the land. This continues to be an issue today. The highest rates of alcoholism and drug addiction of any ethnic group in the United States, it's highest amongst Native Americans. They beat out whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asians. Native Americans have the highest rates of drug abuse, alcoholism, and domestic abuse here in the United States per capita. Reason being is the reservation system's just so ridiculously broken. You see it in instances such as the Dawes Act, where the US government is going to step in and break up the reservations into smaller plots of land. And they're going to break up tribes into smaller family units, putting them on their own little plots. You can really see that here in this cartoon down here at the bottom. If you look, the US government, they're sectioning off portions of land for them. They're essentially wanting them to live like European Americans. They're essentially wanting them to live the white way. Ultimately, this is not going to be the only push towards assimilation. You're also going to see Native American boarding schools, or American Indian boarding schools, as they'd be known at the time, meant to civilize the Native Americans. They're going to be progressively pushed off the reservations. Oklahoma was originally meant to be majority Native American territory, and nowadays it's not that because of what's happening here. Ultimately, Native Americans are really left with two choices, they feel like: assimilate and survive, or stick to your culture and die with it. Debates over citizenship are also going to be prompted, especially in regards to the 14th and 15th Amendment being passed only a decade or so earlier. Elks versus Wilkins, the Supreme Court case is going to decide that the 14th and 15th Amendments don't apply to Native Americans. They aren't protected as U.S. citizens. Out west, many battles and skirmishes are going to take place between the Native Americans and the U.S. military, and atrocities are going to be committed on both sides. If you ever have the opportunity to read it, I'd highly, highly recommend it. I don't have it with me, it's back in my classroom, but Empire of the Summer Moon, it's about the last Comanche leader, Quanah Parker. Quanah Parker is a very interesting character. He himself is half white, half Native American. A lot of times, when Native Americans would raid white settlements, they would kill all of the men. They might take some of the women to work as servants and slaves, and young children had the best opportunity of survival. Oftentimes, Native American tribes would actually take the young children of from the raids and actually raise them to be Native Americans functionally themselves. Cynthia Ann Parker, Quanah Parker's mother, was full white. Eventually, American troops are going to bring her back to the United States, away from the Comanche. I think it's the Comanche. Could be mixing it up. I think it's Comanche, not the Apache. Bring her back from the Comanche, and ironically enough, she wants to return to the Comanche because she had assimilated to the Native American way of life. Kind of the opposite of what we're seeing here. You can see that here as well with this image. This is the same guy. This is the same guy right here after assimilation. Before assimilation, after assimilation. He looks very Europeanized. He looks white. And that's really what you're going to see here with a lot of just this forced pushed assimilation. So this is going to lead us to Ghost Dance and the Wounded Knee. Not all Native Americans are taking this laying down. Many seeking to reinvigorate their culture, reinvigorate their identities, are going to lean to the Ghost Dance movement. You can think of it as a religious and cultural revival. Many prophets during the Ghost Dance revival are going to claim that one day the white man will be driven from the United States and it will be returned to the Native Americans. As you can probably guess, this is going to lead to increased violence on the Native American side and also increased violence on the American side as well, as they view the Ghost Dance movement as a threat. This is all going to result in one of the worst tragedies in American history, and honestly, one of the worst things that the U.S. military has done. On December 29th, 1890, American soldiers are going to open fire on ghost dancers camping at Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. 150 Native Americans are going to perish that day. Most of them are going to be women and children. These weren't soldiers, these weren't even men. Women and children are going to be slaughtered. It's important that we remember these things. When the Native American civil rights movement is getting up and going in the 1950s and 1960s, they're going to point back at Wounded Knee Creek. They're going to be pointing back and they're going to be protesting, ironically enough, at Wounded Knee to make a point, to show the atrocities that had been committed against them and to show the United States that they are still here. This is ultimately going to be a little bit of a shorter lesson. Here you see a photograph depicting the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho leaders. They're going to visit the United States White House in 1877 to advocate for themselves. Unfortunately, it's going to fall on pretty deaf ears. You can see the reservation systems. Oklahoma still being majority reservations by 1890s. Most Native American reservations are out in the West. If you are in one of my classes, here in Texas, north of Houston, up in Lake Livingston, there are Native American reservations. Native American reservations function pretty interestingly. They're quasi-sovereign, they're allowed to make their own rules. Texas doesn't allow gambling, but since they're not under Texas jurisdiction, they're under the federal government's jurisdiction, they do often have casinos on it. There's a lot of corruption involved in that, a lot of corruption on local tribal leaders, and then also a lot of issues and brokenness with the US government as well. The US government doesn't allow the Native American peoples, all of these different tribes, to have full access to the land. There's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of bureaucracy, and there's a lot of just things holding it up. They're not allowed to fully use the land as they see fit, even though it's air quotes their land. And that's going to lead us, honestly, to the closeout of the West. Most of what westward expansion was really in the first half of U.S. history, before 1877. The American Cowboy, to talk briefly about them, they're going to become an icon of American culture. You can think of John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, all of these different Western stars, and really the American Cowboy. I remember going to school in the UK and going to Spain in high school on a mission trip. And I just remember a lot of people thought that I rode my horse to school being from Texas. There were cows all over the place and cactus and tumbleweeds and all of those type of things. The idea of the American cowboy has been kind of culturally ingrained in what it means to be American. Here in Houston, during the livestock show and rodeo, you'll see people in boots and cowboy hats. I mean, you'll see that on the day to day, but you see it all out at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. It's really become a part of American culture. And the unfortunate thing of Westerns in Hollywood is they often depict cowboys as being exclusively white. But that wasn't the case. There were plenty of black and Hispanic cowboys as well. They would often go on these cattle drives. Ultimately, we tend to have this really the view America has of itself is found in the cowboy, right? He does what he wants. Nobody tells him what to do. But at the same time, he stands up for what's right. He stands up for the little guy. And ultimately, he's there to bring law and order out of chaos, even though he himself is free. In reality, being a cowboy sucked. Cattle drives are really where you're going to kind of get the idea of the cowboy. You have cows down south. You need to get them up north and out east, where all of the people are. You really need to get them to Chicago because Chicago's the big meat packing plant area. But the issue is the railroads aren't anywhere near the cows. That's where the cattle drive comes in. You move your cows to a rail town. You move them up to a rail city. From the rail city, they're packed in cars and then they're shipped all around the country. The big issue with the cattle drive is multifaceted. One, these cows are being walked through people's land. I'm pretty sure you would not be a fan if hundreds and hundreds of cows just plowed through your front or backyard. You wouldn't like it. Because of that, a lot of people are going to start putting up fences. They're going to start putting up barbed wire. It's going to make cattle drives harder. On top of that, too, because all of this is happening during the Gilded Age, railroad is being laid constantly. And those rail lines are going to extend further and further into the south, basically making it to where cattle drives aren't really needed. They're not really necessary. The railroad cities, the railroad towns, they don't need to be way far out. They're right there. Ultimately, the cattle drives, the American cowboy, all of these things, while we might think they last for a ridiculously long time, they only last a couple of decades. As many farmers started putting up these roadblocks, as railroads continued to expand, and as people continued to settle out west, the West is going to come to a close. And that's really going to leave the United States with a little bit of an itch. Where do we expand from here? The US is going to start looking beyond its borders at this point. They're going to start looking outside of itself for new trade opportunities and honestly for new land opportunities. It's kind of in Americans' DNA to further expand, to further explore. We were a country founded on those people, on frontiersmen. And you're really going to see that in the next lecture, or I think 2 lectures from now. So, that is the closeout of the American West. If you are going ahead and watching this for one of my courses, please go ahead, write down any questions, any notes that you need to bring to me. If you aren't one of my courses, I encourage you to go ahead, leave a like, leave a comment, go ahead and raise any questions that you might have that I will do to the best of my ability to answer in the comments. Take care, and thank you very much for watching. Professor F.